Hello everyone, welcome to CS-412 Software Security. This is the speedrun of OX09 testing, and especially we're going to look at fuzzing today. It's going to be an exciting day, so please join me along the ride. The learning goals for today are as follows. First, we want to introduce and understand the background of fuzz testing, a simple automated testing technique. Then differentiate between different forms of fuzzing, such as white box testing, greybox testing, or Blackbox testing. Also explain why coverage is a requirement for bug discovery and gives fuzzing a unique edge compared to other testing techniques. Then discuss coverage instrumentation, different kind of trade-offs for coverage. But let's start with a couple of facts that we already know from this class. Software has bugs, right? This is just a basic assumption. This is why we actually need testing. Right? A lot of the bugs are memory safety vulnerabilities. They can be in the kernel, they can be in firmware on actual systems or embedded systems or whatnot. They can be high level in software, as the Acropolis actually showed, and they are plentiful. As for example, here we demonstrate that the Linux kernel at the time of recording has about 1200 or almost 1200 open vulnerabilities that are currently unpatched out there. Right? So this bot just records all the open issues that are at the current point in time. So there's bugs everywhere. And also the vulnerabilities actually increase, or the amount of vulnerabilities increases over time. So we're not really doing a good job at getting rid of issues. There's bugs everywhere. Some of the bugs are exploitable, and we are reporting more and more of these bugs every year. Fact number 2 that we are facing in this class is that software is incredibly complex. So the Chromium environment, together with the Linux kernel and the runtime system, has about 100 million lines of code. Now, 100 million lines of code is very hard to imagine. As a very simple example, you can look at Margaret Hamilton here, which was responsible for writing or supporting the team that wrote all the code to fly to the moon as part of the Apollo missions. So she was responsible for the code for the Apollo guidance computer, as in steering the rocket and actually hitting the moon and not flying past it in a weird freak accident. Right, so and if you're generous, it takes about 2 meters of complexity to fly to the moon, along with specification, test vectors, and everything written in a low-level assembly dialect. Now, if you compare this to 100 million lines of code for Google Chrome, it looks a little bit like this. So it's a big mess of code with a lot of pages that are currently in flux, flying around, changing all the time, and being modified, which breaks specifications left and right. And now here you're actually looking for a bug on a single page that's somewhere being moved around. And this makes this incredibly hard to find and incredibly challenging. In the class in the past, we've looked at the issue of differentiating between preventing or mitigating. And software testing, the current focus of the class, is aiming at prevention. So the goal is to prune bugs ahead of time, where fuzzers explore the programs and sanitizers detect the bugs and serve as an oracle. On the other hand, what we looked at before are mitigations, and mitigations make exploitation harder, make getting code execution harder, or hinder information leaks. So they stop the exploitation of any remaining bugs in the code, whereas software testing tries to get rid of them ahead of time. Now, let's focus on the actual technique of fuzzing, where we're trying to do automatic discovery of bugs in the code. We've got a target that's somewhere in the middle, and then we generate inputs for the target. So these are test vectors that we can use to run the target, and then we observe the execution of the target, and either this is okay or we have found a bug. Right? Sounds simple. Let me give you a bit more concrete example. We've got this target program here. Let's call it test me. And we want to figure out if there's any vulnerabilities in there through fuzzing. So we can run test me and run a simple test on test me by providing, for example, help. And then it tells us test me, give me a 32-bit integer argument. Then we run it again, test me AAAAA, and it tells us please enter an integer. Okay, so far so good. We've ran 2 test inputs now. And we already covered two different functionalities of this program. So let's try to automate this. And we all know that we write real code in bash, in shell scripts. So let's write our fuzzer in bash. So I'm concatenating this fuzzer shell script to the screen, and it's just a very simple while loop. While we still have cycles, do the following. Read 4 bytes from urandom and store it in this input variable. And then run test me with this input, and if it crashes, that's the double pipes, then echo the input that triggered the crash into the file that records all the crashing seeds. Okay? And then you already see the key advantage here, that whenever it crashes, whenever the target crashes, fuzzing will record the actual crashing seed, allowing the developer later on to reproduce the crash at their leisure and figuring out how to fix and debug the target. So this is an incredibly simple technique that allows the developers to scale testing to even large and complex applications in a very simple manner with very low overhead of configuration and very low effort. Let's kind of go into a bit more detail here, right? We've got a target program that we can execute in our environment, and the fuzzer creates input, right? So this is randomly created input that is then being thrown at the program, and the program is executed with this input. And then the fuzzer observes if the target crashes or not. If it crashes, it stores the input in a directory of crashing inputs, allowing the developer to reproduce this crash later on. In any case, the fuzzer continues and creates new input ad infinitum, or until we run out of compute cycles available for this testing. So far so good, right? But this requires us to create new input from scratch each time we run the program. So the fuzzer requires or must create new input or completely new input from beginning to end. So this is extremely challenging to then, for example, test larger files, because the full file has to be created from scratch each time. So a key addition that caused this explosion of new fuzzing technologies about 10 years ago was the introduction of coverage. This means that the target program, was lightly instrumented to keep track of which areas of the program were executed, as in which functionality was executed. And then this allows the fuzzer to detect, even if the program doesn't crash, to kind of abstract what areas or what functionality have been executed, and then whenever new functionality has been executed, store the input in a special directory for further modification. So instead of creating each input from scratch, you take one of the interesting inputs that have been used to create or trigger new functionality before, and then you modify it. And this allows us a gradual search, right? So similar to gradient descent. This allows us a linear search by exchanging and adjusting the target input step by step, instead of always recreating it from scratch, right? So this is a huge advantage compared to creating it from scratch, because imagine the difference between creating a 4 kilobyte file or just flipping 2 bytes in this 4 kilobyte file that you've already created. Right, so this incremental approach enables us to break the search in this multidimensional system into a set of smaller steps. Now, how do we make fuzzing more efficient or most efficient? And it's inherently an engineering question, right? So efficient fuzzing depends on a set of steps. First, test cases must trigger bugs, and for that we'll use coverage-guided fuzzing. The fuzzer must be able to detect bugs, and for this we'll use sanitization. More on this next week as well. And this is why fuzzing is so interesting to me. Performance is key. This is a zero-sum game of a finite amount of cycles. So any cycle we spend to better detect bugs is a cycle we cannot use to create better input, is a cycle we cannot use to create better coverage. Right? So there's a finite amount of cycles available, and we have to distribute these cycles to get the most out of it as possible. So this is an interesting optimization question here that allows us to trigger this interesting behavior. So this is an introduction to automated testing here, right? And testing is the process of analyzing a program to find errors. Last week, we covered the manual testing and static analysis. Manual testing requires a human to actually test and look at the code. And static analysis analyzes the program without executing it. Key advantage of static analysis is that it abstracts across all possible executions, right? It gives you generality, but then these complex constraints often result in state explosion or other kind of limitations which inhibit the scalability. So dynamic analysis, on the other hand, analyzes the program during a single concrete execution and then just chaining multiple concrete execution next to each other to get some form of generality. Dynamic testing focuses on a single concrete run and then gives you additional information. So dynamic testing is therefore inherently incomplete and cannot generalize or cannot give absolute certainty that a bug will never occur. Interestingly, testing can only show the presence of bugs and therefore never demonstrate their absence. So similar to the fundamental laws of static analysis, we'll also define 4 fundamental laws of dynamic testing. And they're somewhat similar to the laws that we've seen before. You can't test code you don't see. Context is key. Coverage matters. And cycles are cheap but finite. So let's break this up step by step. First, you need to test all the code, and you cannot test code that you don't see. Similar to static analysis, build systems are complex, and we need to make sure that the target is actually instrumented with our oracles, with our coverage, instrumentation, and whatnot. The program may rely on a certain compiler, build environment, and whatnot. And not all code is in C, right? So some code can be written in inline assembly, as a binary blob, in Rust, or even JavaScript, right? So you have to set the right configuration across all these different dimensions. So selecting the right target, compiling it with the right flag, setting it up in the right environment, and then providing a good runtime environment and starting seeds are crucial for success in this testing, right? Dynamic law number 2, the context is key. Some bugs are more severe than others, and developer cycles are finite, so we want to find and fix the most severe bugs first. But analyzing bugs actually incurs a cost. Now we have to rank the bugs that we discovered to prioritize which bugs can actually be fixed first. Assume in a fuzzing campaign you found 20,000 bugs. Which one do you analyze first? Which one do you want to triage first? Right? So you need some kind of feedback on what to look for and what kind of indication makes this an interesting bug or not. And you need sufficient context to reproduce and understand the bug. Right? So some bugs, due to non-determinism, could be not reproducible, which makes fuzzing much more challenging. So you need to have the right context so that the bug actually reproduces in the developer environment as well. Now, the key improvement of fuzzing over static analysis, as I already mentioned before, is that the crashing input serves as a proof of vulnerability or proof of concept input that reproduces the issue that was found before. Right? So this is a key advantage. You don't have to search for an input that triggers the crash. You already have it readily available. And this makes this is the basis of this huge success of fuzzing. For static analysis, the feedback is it could crash here, here, or here. For fuzzing, it tells you it does crash here, here, and there. Right? So this is a huge difference between the two. Third law of testing, coverage matters. Fuzzing is inherently complete, therefore coverage and the distribution of energy across the different areas matters a lot. To actually find the bug, you have to execute the code of the bug, right? The code underneath it. So coverage implies some form of completeness, as without executing the code, you wouldn't be able to infer if something if it has a bug or not. Collecting coverage costs resources, so you must balance the coverage and the cost that you get. And coverage comes in many forms and shapes, and we'll hear a bit more about this in a bit. So selecting the right coverage and target is essential. Which brings us to the last testing law. Cycles are cheap but finite. Right? Humans are orders of magnitude more expensive than compute cycles, but both compute cycles and humans have a cost. Developer time is expensive, so use it sparingly, for example, to set up the campaign and to triage the most important bugs. Cycles are cheap, but you still need to use them wisely, so you need to set up the campaign in a way so that it has the most chances of success. So you can use some developer time to reduce cycles by orders of magnitude. As developers will know their code, these developer insights can help guide fuzzing, and then we can leverage the machines to do the heavy crunching. Now, why should you fuzz? Well, fuzzing finds reachable bugs very effectively and therefore results in CVEs. There's two possible use cases. You can either use it proactively as a defense as part of testing, or preparing for offense as part of exploit development, or for bug bounties or whatnot, right? So there's a broad area of opportunities here. When we classify fuzzing, there's two different approaches to input generation, on how we create new input to the target. There's generational fuzzing, which requires some kind of grammar, and then the fuzzing engine will produce input according to the input specification. Now this requires some manual work to define the input grammar that can then be used during the fuzzing process. On the other hand, we have mutational fuzzing that I was already alluding to, which generates inputs by mutating seeds. So seeds that have been determined to be interesting before are slightly mutated by, for example, flipping a couple of bits, bytes, introducing new keywords, combining different seeds and whatnot. Most of the recent work focuses on mutational fuzzing because it has been proven incredibly effective. And coverage-guided mutational fuzzing is the state of the art. Therefore, we'll focus on mutational fuzzing from here on. Let's start with Blackbox fuzzing, right? We've shown this example before, where we continuously execute the target program. And the input is always randomly mutated, right? So this is just Blackbox fuzzing because we don't have coverage, because we don't know if an input that we created is interesting or triggers different functionality. We somehow have to observe or infer what kind of functionality has been triggered to actually know that when we run the program, right? So let's look at this target program. The target program is the binary you're searching bugs in. It needs to be an executable binary, it needs to accept some form of input, and it crashes whenever you hit the bug, or it should crash whenever you hit the bug. And we'll talk more about sanitization later on. Now the fuzzer executes this binary program in some form of execution environment. The fuzzer executes the program with this newly generated input. So the fuzzer needs to provide an environment, and ideally when you trigger a bug, it will not destroy your whole environment. So for example, a program could randomly delete all the files, which would be very bad if the fuzzer does not run the target program in, for example, a Docker container or whatnot. So the execution environment usually creates a process, maybe of a different user, maybe not, and then feeds the target, the input, the newly generated input to the program. Then make sure that the environment is safe. Now the next step is that the fuzzer needs to detect if a crash has actually happened, right? To see if there's an issue with the target. Now, inputs that trigger a crash are put aside for later for this human analysis. And a crash is being detected by, for example, if the execution environment registers a false, segmentation fault, division by zero exception, bus error, whatnot, right? It may also detect resource exhaustion or hangs, for example, by setting a timeout of 5 seconds for the execution, and if the execution takes longer than that, it just signals that. There's also an area of research where you will try to make the program more likely to crash and then detect those crashes. The fuzzer also has a fuzzing queue, right? So this is a set of inputs that it keeps to fuzz, and then it keeps creating new inputs and runs the target program with these newly created input. The fuzzer maintains this queue of inputs to try next, and the executor always picks the first one in the queue. The queue is initially filled with seed inputs, and then seed inputs are reasonable starting inputs that we can use to explore different areas of the target. And the quality of seeds influences the fuzzing results as they serve as a starting point. So even a fuzzer without coverage feedback can be effective if the starting seeds are really good, because then with the starting seeds we can simply randomly mutate individual bytes and still explore the coverage nearby and find issues nearby without having to get very detailed feedback. But coverage helps explore towards new feedback. Now the input mutation, right? Fuzzers must generate new input, so let's focus on that. So the fuzzer picks an input and then mutates it. And fuzzers often split mutation into deterministic and havoc phases. And deterministic means that there's one deterministic operator that is being picked, and then the target is being modified. So for example, each byte, one after the other, is being flipped. The havoc phases would then combine multiple operators randomly to do more heavyweight changes. In the figure in the lower right, you see a fuzzer creating new images, new fuzz images by flipping different parts of the inputs and then modifying things, bytes, parts of the file, and so on, and thereby triggering more and more interesting images that sometimes resemble the original image and sometimes not. Then for black box fuzzing, you continue fuzzing until you run out of cycles. There's initial input seeds, newly generated inputs in the input queue, and then all the crashing inputs. And you simply go on until you think you've sufficiently explored the nearby coverage. Now, as I mentioned before, the big difference that we have on modern fuzzing is that there's coverage. So we get a feedback process, and this coverage is this additional feedback in the process that tells us what kind of functionality we have discovered, allowing a form of guided mutation instead of just random mutation. So we can only store inputs that have triggered new interesting behavior, right? So instead of just mutating the initial seeds randomly one after the other and hoping that we can discover nearby inputs, we can now actually discover new functionality and then use this randomly generated input for further mutation, right? So instead of just mutating the initial seed inputs, we mutate the mutants, right? So this becomes recursive. For that, we need some form of instrumentation, right? So the coverage instrumentation needs to be lightweight and give us feedback on which parts of the program have been executed. So the coverage indicates this functionality and ties an input to explored code areas and program behavior. Counting the number of edges gives good precision at low overhead, but then lacks context. And we'll get into this in a bit. So coverage instrumentation that is most commonly used is some form of block coverage, or at the level of basic blocks. But it could also be which functions are executed, which blocks, which lines, which edges, which paths, data flow, and whatnot. And this simple coverage here just covers and stores a counter for each basic block. And for example, here we learn that the initial block is executed once, there's other, and then the loop is executed a couple of times likely before we exit. Now, one of the issues is that it may miss edges, right? For example, we cannot distinguish which of the edges is being taken or if this edge is being executed or not, right? So by just looking at the coverage map, we will not understand or not be able to infer if this edge has been executed or not. Therefore, we use edge coverage. So edge coverage increases precision and is the ideal trade-off between cost, complexity, and precision. Because now we have a counter for each edge between the basic blocks. So with the collected coverage below, we see that the red arrow was executed once. So we've entered this program once, and then we've executed the loop 8 times. So either the orange or the yellow edge. The orange side was executed 6 times, the yellow 2 times, the purple-ish, pinkish backward edge has been executed 7 times, and the purple one has been executed once. And here we actually learned that the teal edge has never been executed, and it's recorded as a 0. And this tells us, hey, there's this area that has not been executed. Even though every single block has been executed, the context of the break statement has been missed. Therefore, we can target that. Right, so this gives us the necessary precision for this information. So far, so good, right? The fuzzer collects this coverage information for each run and then compares this to a global aggregation of fuzzing, as the fuzzer tracks the global coverage that has the maximum amount of coverage that has been seen. Now, instead of collecting and keeping the precise coverage, the fuzzer generally approximates this as the topmost bit. So for each edge, it stores a counter where the topmost bit that has been seen is being across all the inputs is stored. If any edge increases, then you store the seed for further mutation because you want to limit the amount of new seeds that you store. So for example, we've got this maximum global coverage below. We observe a new input, and we see that this is the collected coverage. And here we can quickly see that none of the counters increases the topmost bit. With 7, we are almost there, but we're just not getting it. As the fuzzer creates another input, we see that we're doing one more loop iteration. And now it increases to 8, the topmost bit increases. We update the global coverage, and we store this input in the seed queue for further mutation. So coverage-guided Greybox fuzzing lives and profits from these mutations. The mutations are no longer blind, but tied to the coverage that we have explored. This gives us feedback on what mutations and previous inputs triggered this new and interesting behavior, and the fuzzer keeps input that triggers new coverage for further mutation, allowing it to incrementally explore and change things. The fuzzer periodically discards old inputs that are no longer interesting and have been subsumed by others. So there's this interesting optimization strategy on when to discard, how to adjust, and how to move back and forth. Coverage-guided Greybox fuzzing focuses on mutations and inputs that have triggered new functionality. So we skew the fuzzer towards these new and interesting code areas. And fuzzing has pretty much exploded as a research topic. So it started around 2013 with the introduction of Greybox fuzzing. This is fuzzing with coverage feedback. Before, original fuzzing was invented in the 90s, but Blackbox fuzzing was very limited in exploring new functionality. So Greybox fuzzing then by itself explored the different kind of sub-functionalities that were reachable through these different styles of mutation. And all of these fuzzers are papers at top tier conferences that have been published in the last couple of years. So you see this massive explosion of new fuzzers that came out. So when we are tracking coverage, the fuzzer effectively explores these new code areas and can steer the exploration. think of this as controlling the exploration phase. Code coverage is cheap to obtain and usually precise enough to give us sufficient feedback on what needs to be explored, how it needs to be explored, and so on. There's many different flavors of coverage with very subtle differences that can be looked at. Interesting future research in this area would be efficient and effective alternatives to code coverage, as in if you don't get code coverage, what else can you do? State coverage, like targeting stateful targets or programs and protocols, network protocols, and so on. And then also combining different types of coverages at different granularities of wherever this is needed. Let's recap. The fundamental laws of dynamic testing are that you can't test code you don't see. Context is key. Coverage matters, and cycles are cheap but finite. So as a summary, today we heard about automated fuzz testing. The two different aspects of fuzz testing, namely generational testing and mutational testing, whereas mutational testing is the most commonly used, together with coverage-based information that allows us to adjust the exploration in different ways. The program is executed with automatically created input. The fuzzer must be able to detect violations, for example, through a crash, to store inputs that are of interest to the developer, and to have a form of feedback for Greybox fuzzing to infer if a seed creates or triggers new functionality. Inputs are created by applying different kind of mutation operators, and coverage feedback indicates the promising inputs for future mutation. Today, fuzzing is the key technique to find bugs. It uses edge coverage to get a fine-grained view of the executed program, and often developers select good starting seeds to then custom tailor the fuzzing to a given functionality, to give it like an edge to start the exploration. This is all for today. Thank you, and I'll see you next week for the sanitizers and writing good sanitizers.